You're listening to Learning How to Live, the podcast about what happens after you wake up from the life you were told to want. I'm Quinn Stainfield-Bruce, and 6 years ago my best attempt at life had failed. Now I'm learning how to rebuild work, love, health, and self-worth, and I'm inviting you to learn alongside me. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Learning How to Live, Season 1, Episode 3. Money After Awakening. You see, I thought money was the root of all happiness. I thought that is the key. If I could make enough money, I can be happy forever. If I can make enough money, then I can find the right woman to love me. If I make enough money, I can buy enough things to change how I feel and to constantly be happy. If I can make enough money, then I can buy the house and the car, and then people will see me as worthy, and I can finally feel worthy. I had an incredibly dysfunctional relationship with money for the vast majority of my life. And, I remember hearing something which really hit home, which was, if money made you happy, then why aren't all wealthy people happy? It's the same as if being slim made you happy, then why aren't all slim people happy? It's a nonsense. However, I unequivocally believed it to be true for the vast majority of my life, and it impacted me in so many ways. And so I'm going to touch on what money is like today after awakening. How in learning how to live, a big part of that is learning financial security, financial responsibility. Like we don't. I'm going to be generalistic here. We don't get taught about money at school. Certainly not in schools in England. I went to good ones. I went to ones that were alleged good ones. I went to expensive ones. I went to private boarding school. And even there, we didn't get taught about money, at least not in my day. I didn't know what a credit card was till I was about 21 and I won a project with Visa. I had a concept of it, but I didn't really understand what it was, how it worked. And this is the thing, unless our parents are teaching us, we generally don't know. And on the whole, it's my understanding that most parents don't really have a strong grasp of money. But even if they do, it probably comes with all sorts of dysfunctions, because whether you come from a household of plenty or a household of little, or whether you come from a mindset of where parents were constantly feeling they were in lack or in constant spending, they all come with their own narratives, their own dysfunctions, it all manifests as a dysfunctional relationship with money. And I had no idea. I had no idea that it was a thing. Like I said, in its simplest form, my mindset was, if I can make enough money, I'll be happy. There's so many layers to money. There's so many layers that I've come to learn. For example, one of them is one's practical relationship with it, how to use it, how to interact with it, how to practically use money. I mean, some of these are very common sense to me now, but they're things that just weren't then. And, there's lots of people on social media talking about it, things like from the psychology of money. You can now learn about investment. You can learn about savings. You can learn about all of these things that I just never knew about. So there's this practical side of it, but then there's a very spiritual side of money. Right? And there's a spiritual relationship with money. Like I said, if having money made you happy, if having money was enough, then why aren't the people that have a lot of money, or even just some money, happy? And I know a lot of people who are wealthy, who have money, who are very dissatisfied because they don't understand the spiritual side of money. And then there's like individual, personal, emotional relationships with money, right? Like mine, and I'm going to get into it in a minute about how my upbringing created and carved a certain relationship with money that I've had to spend years now unraveling so that I can reprogram. And it's really a very therapeutic thing, a very therapeutic aspect of money. So practically, spiritually, therapeutically, emotionally, money can be a very complex thing. But also I'm going to talk about how now today it's a very simple thing. And I'll come back to that later. But I'm going to start with like my story, and how my relationship with money came to be. And I grew up again in a fairly privileged but dysfunctional household, where things were never enough. And again, in true belief of I love my parents dearly, and I genuinely believe that they did the best they could with the tools they had. But irrespective, what happened, and the way that they are, and the way that they were, is how they are and how they were, and it can't be negated, and it is part of this story, so I'm going to have to tell it. But I'll try and be as loving as I can about it. But like I say, I don't really remember my parents being particularly happy. We had a lot of stuff. We had this sailing boat in the Caribbean that we used to go to on holidays. We had a villa in Mallorca that we used to go to. Again, I don't remember being on these holidays and my parents smiling and actually having a good time. I mean, they'll say they did. I don't really remember that energetically. And there was just this constant dissatisfaction. My father, who bless him, the way that he, a lot like me, garnered happiness by being able to change how he felt, and how he did that was by changing the scene. If he wanted to, feel better, he'd go on vacation. If he wanted to feel better about things or himself, he'd get a new car. He never had an issue with alcohol or drugs or anything like that, but he loved to spend money to change how he felt. And he constantly did it. And as a result, made and spent a lot of money over our lives. My mother was a compulsive under-earner for some reason, being she's a very intelligent woman, but never fulfilled her potential financially, always kept herself quite small. So it was always, money was always in sort of short supply for her, despite the fact that my father would always be spending a lot of money. But what this meant for me growing up, what I witnessed was this bizarre dichotomy of new cars in the driveway and occasionally credit cards being declined in the supermarket. And as a child, things like that didn't make a lot of sense. It was like, well, are we wealthy or are we not? And it was, we'd go on holidays, but there was, they were never particularly glamorous in many ways. There's always a sort of shortcoming about it. It was just a very sort of weird dynamic. However, the way that my father would show love, because it was the way that he had generally been shown love, was to buy stuff. He had his father, his adopted father, who was a very good man, showed him love by being able to get him a new car or whatever else he needed. There wasn't much of an emotional exchange. And so with all of the best intentions, that was how I was shown love. So early on, I start to align money and things to not just pleasure and happiness, but also, love. Like if you can't buy me things, or if I can't buy you things, then this is an issue as to whether I am loved or can love. Really, as you can imagine, dysfunctional as I started becoming an adult and entering romantic relationships, and then my relationship with my own children. So, so when my mother left, and when I was 11, 12, and it was just me and my dad, that became the sort of dynamic. I was want of nothing materially, but I wasn't really seen, I wasn't heard, and I didn't really understand what love was. And so money, to quote The Wolf of Wall Street, money was, fun coupons. Money was a thing that I used to change how I feel. Money was a thing that I used to make myself feel better. Money was a thing that I used to feel good. And that was the relationship. And that didn't really matter whether it was borrowed money, earned money, a credit card. Like, it was all there to facilitate my well-being. And over the years, and as addiction sort of down spiraled and various other things, that relationship became more and more dysfunctional, till it ended up becoming a very painful relationship. And I do use the word relationship here, because we must be able to acknowledge our individual relationships with money. I didn't have a healthy one from the start. But that relationship, I became very abusive to money throughout, my adult life. I treated it very horribly, with no respect at all. It was simply there to please me. And, whether it was with addictive behavior or anything else, it was just a constant. It didn't matter how much money I made, I never really had any at the end of the month. It didn't matter whether I was making £1,000 a month or I was making £20,000 a month. It was gone. And that is not a sustainable way to live. It meant there was no real security. It meant there was no freedom. One of the biggest lessons I came to learn about money and investing and saving is that when you save, when you invest money, you're buying instant freedom. It's not for something in the future. It's actually, you are buying freedom today. Because to have money invested, to have money saved, to have that feeling is a sense of freedom and a sense of strength. And I didn't understand that. So in not having any money ever, it meant I was in a constant pursuit of having to get more. Not because I enjoyed the process of earning it, but because I needed to have it, like a life or death scenario. And again, that's not a way for one to live their life. So, without wanting to, lay into my parents much more, the habits that I received were the habits I received. I never got sat down and explained about saving and investment. I never got sat down and explained about tax. I was never taught about credit cards. I wasn't even taught about phone bills. Like, I remember my first phone bill, when I decided I didn't like it anymore, I just stopped paying it. I didn't think that there would be any consequences. And again, I came from, quite privileged education. And I just didn't think there was a consequence. I didn't understand credit. Didn't understand credit ratings. The way that I teach and talk to my children about money today, I mean, they're going to, I want to set them up their own little investment portfolios as soon as possible, just so that they can start getting a feel for it. So anyway, my early life was my early life. I go into adulthood, and you can imagine how this impacts my romantic relationships. If I'm constantly thinking that I need to be able to be, that my lovability, my worthiness to a woman is measured by what I can provide, then I'm constantly in the pursuit of more so that I can provide so that I can be loved. I mean, honestly, when one reflects on it, it's very, very sad. That's how I lived my life. But it also meant that I would constantly put myself down, that when I thought about the type of woman I'd want to be with, whether they were ambitious or just kind or loving or whatever, my default subconscious, and I didn't realize this till much later, would turn around and say, but they won't want you. They won't want you. So you better settle for something toxic and dysfunctional. You better settle for someone who is going to treat you not so nicely, because that's your level. and I could link it directly back to money. I could say, well, look, if I don't have millions in the bank, then I'm not worthy of a £1 million, partner. That's how I thought. I wasn't aware of this, of course, but that is how I operated. So I would settle in so many ways, and it created so much pain. And I remember coming into recovery, and there were many things I had to sort out after rehab before my relationship with money. First of all, I had to stop the drugs and the alcohol. Right? That was number one. And once I did that, it was then working on my self-worth continually. But other dysfunctions came up, like food. I was eating a banana bread for breakfast every day for about 6 months. I'd walk in. I remember going into the supermarket, buying a loaf of banana bread and eating it like a Mars bar on the way out. I think one morning I ate a Battenberg at 7 a.m., like a whole Battenberg cake. It was crazy. So I then had to deal with that. And then I looked at romantic relationships, because I really felt at this point that I could, I deserved to have some sort of love and happiness in my life. And so actually before the romantic relationships was my physical fitness, because I thought, right, I need to get myself physically fit, so at least I'm aesthetically attractive to people. And then after that, it was romantic relationships, which I'll do in another episode. And bizarrely, it wasn't until about 3 years ago that I decided to look at the money. And I remember why. It was because I had 3 years in recovery at this point, and not blowing my money on stupid things and things like, drugs or whatever, turned out that actually I could make quite good money, but also I could generate a pretty healthy credit rating, which I'd never had in my life. And I actually ended up with a credit rating of 999 at one point, which is, I think it's as good as you can get. At that point, I got a couple of decent credit cards, which again, I'd never really had in my life because my credit rating wasn't very good. And I'd managed to, max them out, pay them off, max them out. And it became very unhealthy and unsustainable. And I had this moment where I said to myself, how am I ever going to be free of this? How is my relationship with money ever going to change so that I might actually be able to save? How am I going to change my relationship with money so that no, because I was actually afraid. I was afraid that no matter how much I earned, I'd always never have any. That's the truth. I was terrified of this. I was like, I'm going to go my whole life just constantly making and spending money, and this will never, ever change. And, 3 years into recovery at that point, having dealt with, romantic relationships and drugs and fitness and health, I was like, this is like, it reminded me of the surrender of the drugs. It was like, it was that level of, I don't want to live life like that. I would rather not live life almost than have to live life in this constant pursuit of more. What do I do? And this is, as I've learned to experience with the universe, when I make these big surrenders, when I make these sort of internal decisions and express them externally, the universe tends to respond. And interestingly, at that point, the universe responded by sort of ceasing all revenue streams that I had at the time. Things had just been flowing pretty comfortably for a while, and then they all stopped. And I ended up in like really profound financial difficulty. And over the course of that, I got to make some pretty exciting discoveries. I got to go into, I went and did some 12-step recovery around money. And there is 12-step recovery for money for anyone who's struggling with maybe debt or under-earning or some other issue. And I got to learn about how my feelings of self-worth had been impacting my relationship with money the whole time, just like with the drugs, just like with the food, just like with the romance. It was all the same. And, I think the biggest thing for me initially was just the ability to say, okay, I surrender. And the first thing that one does in 12 in the money fellowships in 12 step is that you cut up all your cards. You immediately start, making these spending plans and documenting what you're spending on. You create these plans and you create a bit of a fellowship of people who you become somewhat accountable to. And I immediately started looking at how I spent money and the way I spent money. And in the acknowledgement of how powerless I was over this habit of spending, I got to open myself up to a potentially new way to live with money. And so my whole journey of recovery had been around, first of all, uncovering and acknowledging my worthiness, or my feelings of unworthiness and being unlovable. And then seeing how those two core beliefs had manifested in various aspects of my life, and then rewriting the program, right? Being able to uncover my true worthiness and my true lovability, and then reapproach life from that place. What had become unbelievably apparent to me is that I aligned so much of my self-worth to money. So much. And it was unbelievably ingrained and toxic. And I still in many ways battle this today. I'm still aware of it at times. It's very easy to put myself beneath someone who has a lot more, or to put myself above someone who has a lot less. It's very easy for me, or at least historically, it's very easy for me to beat myself up that perhaps to say that I'm a bad father because I couldn't provide a certain thing or lifestyle or holiday for my children, and therefore I'm not a good father. That if I can't provide a certain way for a romantic partner, then I am less of a man. These are the types of narratives that I lived my life like. This concept of worthiness, that if I could just make enough money, then I would feel worthy. If I could live in that house, then I would feel enough. And what's been so fascinating is that I have many friends who are very wealthy, who live in all sorts of grandeur and luxury. And, they have affirmed and confirmed with me that it is, in fact, bullshit. There is no arrival. Right? There is no arrival. I remember when I first moved to this, the nice area that I live in, I was convinced I needed a Mercedes. I nearly ended up buying one. It would have been the most ridiculous purchase I'd ever made, completely unnecessary. Why did it feel so important to me? It felt so important to me because it's what people would see me in. It's like I can't live in a nice area and drive a Vauxhall, which is what I was driving at the time. That wasn't going to be an acceptable thing. I needed to be in a Mercedes. That's what people needed to see me in. If I was going to be dating, I needed to be in a Mercedes because otherwise the right woman wouldn't want me. This exhausting narrative is how I lived. In entering that phase of not having money, in entering that phase of changing my behaviors with money, chopping up all of the credit cards, living very frugally, watching my spending, just being very, very militant and on top of it, I got to learn some real humility. I ended up buying a car for about £1,600, like an old Fiat 500. That I was so I went from thinking I needed a Mercedes to driving this Fiat 500, which was an absolute nightmare because it literally broke down all of the time. And I didn't actually, like, all I wanted was for it to work, and it didn't. Most of the time, my children learned a lot of humility in this period as well. But I got to sort of really decouple, and I met my now partner, who we've been together 3 years. I met her when I had nothing. I met her when, and so I got to learn how to love with the kindest, most wonderful woman. I got to learn to love when I had nothing. If there was a better way for my ego to have been smashed, that narrative of my worthiness being attached to money was to meet the kindest, most beautiful, lovely woman when I had nothing, and where we fell in love in that environment. And it's just incredible. So, okay, what am I trying to say here? The understanding how one's relationship with money is really, really important. One way to look at it is, imagine if money was a person and they walk into the room. How do you instantly feel? And I could tell you, for most of my life, the way I felt if money was to walk into the room was I'd feel scared. I would feel like I'd feel shame about how I've treated it. I'd feel like it's someone that I had abused. Like I would have felt unsafe. Like, these aren't healthy ways to have a relationship with money. And actually, if you ask me today, how do I feel if money walked into the room? I'd say, yeah, I'd feel really good. It's like a life partner, a business partner, just this trusted, life partner of mine. And this is the energetic frequency that I've learned to foster and to garner, and to move to. Understanding the concept of abundance, right? Abundance. We on this planet, we are surrounded by abundance, and money is simply a frequency. Money is a frequency. Cash, Bitcoin, numbers on your bank statement, none of these things are in fact real. In Roman days, people were paid in salt. It's where the word salary comes from, right? Salt. It's the actual concept of money being a thing. Money physically isn't a real thing. The frequency of money. This is the frequency of abundance. This is the feeling of abundance, right? And what I've learned is it's very hard to have a healthy relationship with money if you can't tap into that frequency of abundance. And what do I mean by the frequency of abundance? I mean being able to look outside at nature and seeing all of the abundance of nature, to be able to look at one's children who are healthy and to be able to say that they are abundantly healthy, to be able to walk through a supermarket and just see all of the fresh fruit and be able to acknowledge the abundance of fruit that's there. It's like we get so caught up in the idea of numbers on a tin, especially today in today's society. And you look at social media and all of the different threads talking about, make this much money, get this many followers, generate this much. I made this much this month. You can make this much too. Use AI. It's heinous, and it won't actually make you happy. That's the other thing. There is no arrival, and anything that you do make with money can be lost at the same time anyway. Now, don't get me wrong. Money is so important, and it's to have a healthy relationship with it has changed my life. But it's just so important to have that perspective. And I talked earlier about the different types of wealth. Wealthiness isn't just money, and to focus just on money will leave one very, very unhappy. One must also look at their spiritual wealth, their connection with something bigger than themselves. One must also understand and look at their relational wealth, the wealth with others, with their family, with their friends. Romantic wealth, how their loving relationship, their loving and committed relationship. What about their physical wealth? How, they'd like to be healthy. Take a billionaire who gets given a week left to live, and you see how important money becomes to them in that moment. And how many of us have an abundance of health and vitality, and yet feel immense lack all of the time because of money. So being able to explore these different dynamics of wealth, to be able to acknowledge them and integrate them, and to start creating that energetic flow. And this is a big part of what I've come to learn, right? So if worthiness isn't found in money for me, where is it found? How am I worthy? And I'm worthy through the actions I take, the estimable acts I do, being of service to others, being kind, being loving, all to the best of my ability. And that, money can be a facilitator of that. Money can be a facilitator of my purpose. If my purpose is to do estimable things, if my purpose is to act from love and kindness, and money can help me facilitate that purpose, well, that's fantastic. But it's not the money that makes me worthy. It's the fact that in my heart, that's what I am aligned to, being of service. And so that's why when I think if money was to walk into the room today, how I would feel about it, I would welcome them as my life and business partner. Facilitating the things that I want to achieve in this world from a place of love, not from a place of my own selfish will. A big thing that I've come to learn is critically important is the concept of tithing. Real generosity. Tithing is the concept of giving away 10% of what you earn, without wanting or expecting anything in return. It's a very spiritual concept, but the practical action of it is instantly gratifying. But I don't want this to become a spiritual conversation at this juncture. There'll be plenty of time to do that in later episodes. But yeah, so money after awakening, understanding why one has a relationship with it is the first thing, honesty. And then being able to tap into the frequency of money, understanding abundance, understanding wealth. And then there's a million ways that you can practically, healthily apply money. I like the third concept. You take a third of your money is for your rent and your bills. A third of it is for saving and investing, and a third of it is for you to do what you want with, to enjoy life. There's the old quote from David Copperfield of something along the lines of, make 18 shillings, spend 17 happy. And obviously overspending on that is not happy. That's great. But actually what you do with that 17 is really, really important. And that's, again, understanding how to apply that is really special. And so, like I said, the third is great. And when it comes to investing is an instant benefit because you're investing in freedom today. And that was a massive paradigm shift for me. Anyway, there's lots more to go into on this. And I look forward to having some guests who know infinitely more about money than I do, who will be able to talk further to it. Thanks. Thanks for listening to Learning How to Live. If this sparks something for you, share it, subscribe, and remember, you don't have to escape your life. You can build one worth staying for.